I know.
All right, guys, good afternoon. I can have a seat. You're not going to need your Chromebooks today. The internet's moving super slow anyway, so close those up if you would. And before we get started, just a couple of things looking forward here. First off, it was good to see everybody Saturday. Everybody looked great, so hope you had a good time. For me, most problems, a lot of fun. Twister was fun. You know,
I was I fell asleep
Oh, did you? Yeah. Oh, not. Yeah, your mom corrected me. She said, you know, we built in like a little bit of time there where you can take a break and go get something to eat. I know I kind of had a feeling it was going to happen, but it was fun though, and congrats for those of you that got prizes. Some of you, like Rachel Inman, got like 7 prizes.
And I was on the phone and I couldn't hear you, and I'm sorry multiple times. What?
She won a number of prizes. You only get which one did you land with though?
The fridge.
The fridge.
And actually, my dad needed it for mine, so. And I looked it up, and the fridge was only like $8.
Way to extort your parents. That's great. American capitalism right there. That's the way it's supposed to be right there. Good job. Okay, hey, nothing. Everything great. And hey, let's talk a little bit about what's coming up. You know, we don't have a whole lot of time left, and those of you that are checking out your grades, the grades in Alma are updated, with the exception of the assignment that we started Thursday and hopefully finished up on Friday. If you have not turned in your Vietnam in verse, where you have the 2 songs and the columns, that needs to be turned in today for a chance at full credit. So please be mindful of that. Beyond that, though, as we go through this week, today is our last time where we will have any sort of questions that we have to answer together. Those obviously take the place of notes, but this is the last one for this unit and for the class. We'll be done with those after today. And once we get through this, then starting tomorrow, we will start looking at wrapping up this unit of study. We've been in this unit since before spring break. We've been covering a lot of time with it, a lot of topics. We will finish it up like we did a few weeks ago, where you will have choice in how you get that last grade. You can choose a multiple choice test. There is a written option, and then there will be the creative option. Again, this time, it is not a newspaper, it's something different, but it's the same idea. You can use your creativity if that's what you would prefer. Tomorrow we'll go over those options, get you to choose, and then you're going to have some time Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday to get prepped for that and ready to go, with Friday being the collection day. It's if you do the test, either one, that's when you'll take it, and then if you decide to do the creative, that's when it will be due. That's obviously a rather large grade, and it's a grade that, you know, if you're well prepared for it, you should do very well. So keep that in mind. Journals are something else that'll be due this week. We have one more journal coming tomorrow, Journal 18, and then you can turn those in. Those are due Wednesday for a chance at full credit. All of this, by the way, is on the course calendar on the website, so if you need some reminders, you can definitely check that out. Beyond this week's test, next week we're going to do a very fast, way too fast review of 80s and 90s America. It's going to be super quick. It's probably, you know, I don't know. I'm not real happy with it, but running out of time, unfortunately. And then the week after that, so that's this week, next week, that third week, we have basically 3 things that we will focus on. One will be the President's Test. Okay, I've said that for multiple times. It's states and capitals during the first semester, presidents during the second. You can start thinking about that now. The reviews are all on the website. They're easy to find on the right side. And it's the same thing. These are tools that students have shared with me in the past and have said, Mr. Klein, these helped me. One of them being a rap, which if you decide to go down that path, be prepared for it to be stuck in your head. I suppose that's why it's good. But, man, it's an earworm. It lodges in there, and it's frustratingly annoying. But it does tend to stick there. So whatever works for you, there are several review options on there. Don't be shocked if those reviews don't include President Trump. He's fairly new. A lot of these reviews were done before him, so don't be shocked by that. But as long as you remember he goes in that last spot, right, then you're good. Okay. And beyond that, I mean, it's, you know, getting ready for the final exam. Everybody will take the final exam, but it's like first semester. all multiple choice. You'll be able to bring in a research aid for that. It's not something I want you to stress about. That last week before finals, we will also be watching what I think is actually a pretty good review for the final, and that is Forrest Gump. And that's, I love that movie. It really does have a lot of stuff in it. How many of you have seen Forrest Gump? Yeah, so I'm actually going to reference that movie today. It has an important part to play in what we cover. But it ends up being a nice review, kind of a nice way to wrap things up for the semester. So that's what we're looking at, guys. So moral of the story is there's not a lot left, but there are a lot of points left. If you're needing points, you have opportunities to get those points. There's no doubt about it. Right? To here, though, we're going to turn our attention to our last set of questions for the year. These, of course, are worth 10 points, completion grade, if you answer the questions correctly, and should be just a little boost that you can add to your overall grade. Yes, sir. You need to know their names in order. That's it. Yes.
Do we need another full name? Full name?
Depends. There's two Harrisons, Ethan. Don't give me that look. There's two Harrisons, Ethan. There's two Adams. There's two Bushes.
Yeah, that was
That's, George Adams is not. Right, Ethan? Right? Your sweatshirt is out of this world. Zing! Zing! Zing!
Do you like Big Brother?
Do I what?
Big Brother.
I do not. You? Is that a person?
It's a robot.
Okay. All right. What's that thing? Oh, it's on there. What? I think you're looking at me like I swear you're
2 days of research in the morning.
All right, we ready to roll? Hey, let's do something real quick here. Just got to keep things moving. I'm going to go through these questions. I'm going to tell you which slides they're on. So if we go past the slide, you don't have the question answered. You know what you're missing. Question 1 will be on the first slide. So that's one if you want. First slide there. Question 2 and 3 will both be on the second slide. Question 4 will be on the third slide. Question 5 will be on the fourth slide. And then the entire back is on the fifth slide. So, should keep you going. Now, we're looking at just a quick look at 1970s America. This is going to be somewhat similar to the Kennedy-Johnson discussion that we had a couple of weeks ago, or I guess a week ago. And it's going to focus more on some of the politics of the 70s. And I got to tell you, the overwhelming theme here of today is going to be ups and downs. In fact, that was the question I had up there when you came in. How might somebody describe this decade as ups and downs? Very good things happen, but the negatives are really bad. If you've ever heard the old saying, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, that's a good way to describe the 70s. I think I can tell you that a lot of Americans leave the 70s going into the 80s, and they're not feeling real good. They're not feeling good about a lot of different things. We'll look at some examples of those, but thankfully, things are going to get better in the 80s. And I'm born then, and that's a real highlight. You're welcome. Okay. Yeah. All right, so here we go. 70s, we got 3 guys that we will focus on. Nixon, Ford, and Jimmy Carter. So those are our 3 guys, but I'll tell you, of those 3, Nixon is definitely going to be the main attraction here. Right? So Nixon is going to initially get elected in 68. Okay, we talked about Lyndon Johnson last week, said that he was an extremely popular president, did a lot of good, but there was this one thing, this anchor tied to his foot, that really drags down his legacy. And what was that? What? Lyndon Johnson. Vietnam, right? Vietnam, by the time Johnson leaves the White House in 68, Americans are becoming increasingly hostile towards the idea of being involved in Vietnam. He decides not to run, which allows Richard Nixon, who got beat by John F. Kennedy way back in 1960, the chance for maybe a little bit of redemption here, and he does manage to win. All right, so he's going to come into office with some sizable questions that he's going to have to deal with. Now, what I want to start off first are to look at some of the good moments. And I tried to pick the photographs to match the mood here. So we got Nixon giving a thumbs up. These are good things that we are about to cover, and these are all domestic good things, all right? Things that affect us here at home, domestic policy, anything that affects just this country and not other countries. So Nixon does a lot of good. One thing I think stands out would be that we're going to see something added to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that was very, very much focused in on racial discrimination. By the time we get to 68 and certainly into the 70s, we're starting to see a very powerful women's right movement that is going to emerge, and they are pushing for, obviously, gender equality, but certainly an end to gender discrimination, whether it be pay, the opportunity to get a job for which they are qualified, you name it, they want an end to it. So Title IX is going to be added to the Civil Rights Act as an amendment, and it is going to ban any form of gender discrimination. So that's obviously a good thing here. Another thing that I think stands out, I think you could argue that there are not a whole lot of presidents, maybe Teddy Roosevelt would stand out, but the list is pretty short of presidents who have done as much to benefit the environment as Richard Nixon. He will create the EPA. Anybody know what the EPA stands for? No, we got both. That's it. Environmental Protection Agency. This is a group that is still around today, very powerful. This is the group that goes out to factories and other places, but factories I think kind of stand out and make sure that they're not pumping toxic pollution into the atmosphere, that they're not dumping toxic waste into the rivers. That's kind of an American thing to do. We don't know what to do with it. Just throw it in the river. And that became a problem earlier in the previous century, in the 1900s, when a river in northern Ohio caught on fire. The river caught on fire. Let that soak in for a minute. The reason why that body of water, by the way, which is used to put out fire, actually caught on fire was because there was so much pollution in that river. And, this is why the EPA does good, to make sure that our rivers and things like that are going to remain clean. We're also going to see the Endangered Species Act. I think most, if not all of you, have heard of endangered species. This is what puts that list together. If you're an animal group that shows, lowering numbers, you might get put on this list. Makes it illegal to hunt you. Really anything that might harm that animal group. Eventually, hoping that we can take them off the list as they've been left alone to grow in their numbers. All right, so we thank Nixon for pushing that through. Something that I think is, I don't know if it's just a personal kind of thing, but there's a group in the government called the National Endowment for the Arts. And, one of the things that's kind of bothered me as I study history is that it seems like whether it's the government or whether it's public schools, whatever it might be, when we find ourselves in a budget crunch, all right, we need to find a place to cut some money. Seems like the convenient place to always target are the arts. And I see that a lot of times in public schools. My mom was a choir teacher, a really good one at that. She was laid off 3 times from 3 different schools simply because that school decided to cut money to their arts department. That bothers me. I can't imagine how you could possibly look at theater, music, dance, choir, band, you name it, the arts, the actual arts classes, and think that would be a logical place to cut, that we could just do without them. But that happens more than you might imagine. Nixon is reversing that. Nixon is a president who's going to raise the budget for the NEA by quite a bit. When he comes into office in 68, only $7 million is being given to arts programs across the country. By the time he leaves office, that's up to $60 million. All right, that's a significant jump, and I think we could say that that's a big good. So that's question 1 there. Ask for you to pick, identify, and explain at least two positives that we see happen within the country. I've given you 3, you pick your 2. Now, taking a bit of a switch here, going to foreign policy, again, I think we're going to see a lot of ups here. All right, Nixon's presidency is filled with a ton of ups. It's just that his one down is a whammy. Right? So let's look at some good things that happened in our relationship with other countries. I think we have to start, of course, in the elephant in the room here, and that's Vietnam. We've spent a lot of time covering Vietnam. When we last talked last week, we had seen that that the solution to the Vietnam problem had become, let's just keep dumping more and more and more troops into that country, and we're not seeing any results. If anything, things are getting worse instead of getting better. That's why Johnson decides not to run again. So Nixon inherits this mess that is Vietnam, and it's pretty clear to him that we've got to figure out a way to get the U.S. out of Vietnam, but we've got to do it the right way. And so Nixon ends up coming up with a program that he calls, there we go, that he refers to as Vietnamization. So question 2 asks, what is the name of the program? There you have it. And then how does it work? Now, Nixon's mindset is that, we cannot have, almost 550,000 American troops in Vietnam on Tuesday and then have those troops out of there on Wednesday. All right, and logistically, it just will not work. And it's certainly not going to make things better in Vietnam. If we were to do that, Vietnam will fall to the communists. So the question is, how do we do this? It's got to be a slow, gradual withdrawal of American troops. And the idea is that when we take 50 troops out of Vietnam, we replace them with 50 Vietnamese troops. All right? We've been working with the South Vietnamese Army, the SVA, for quite a while now. So what you're going to see is that we're going to ramp up the type of training that we're going to give these men. We're going to make sure that they are well armed. And as we pull American troops out, we're going to replace those troops with South Vietnamese troops. All right, that's the goal here. We do have the last American troop out of there in 1973. And at that point, it becomes South Vietnam's war to win or lose. How do you think it goes? Yeah, it's pretty bad. It takes North Vietnam and the communists all of about 6 months to finish up South Vietnam and bring that country back together. To this day, Vietnam is communist. So, we said this was not a win for us. There you see why, right? But at least it does get troops home. I mean, that's going to do a lot to make Nixon very popular because this war, people were so against this war. Okay. Something else that I think stands out, this is getting into question 3 here. We have to acknowledge what Nixon's going to do with China. We have a very famous photograph up here. I've got a color version of it behind Bo. Obviously, we've got, there we go. I got Nixon over here on the right, and then on the left, the leader of China. You might know his name. Thank you, Bo, for being the smart one here. What's the name there? Mao. Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong. All right. So Mao is the guy we talked about at the very beginning of this unit, before spring break. We talked about in 1949, China falls to communism. The guy behind all of that is this guy, who was obviously much younger at that point. I'm an old guy now. Chairman Mao, as he was called. Mao is the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I think it's very clear, we try to make it very clear how the United States feels about communism. We don't like it. And so after Chairman Mao brought communism to China, we decided to turn our noses. We'll show them. We'll just ignore them. Okay? And so here we have a situation where, I would guess that if I were to give you a blank world map right now, you could probably find China, right? How many of you feel confident on the blank world map that you could find China? There we go, yeah. All right? China is this giant country down here. I mean, I don't know how we miss it. So what we did from 1949 until 1972 is we just said, talk to the hand. One of these things. We refused to even acknowledge their existence. We stopped trading with them. We stopped talking to them. I don't know what we thought we'd accomplish here. Like, boy, the United States is really mad at us. Well, they're giving us the silent treatment. We should give up communism. No, if anything, communism became even more entrenched. Here comes Nixon, and he's like, this is just stupid. Are we in junior high? What are we doing? All right. The best part of it all, for me at least, is that we did still talk about China. Like world history classes, U.S. history classes taught about China. It's just that when they taught about China, it wasn't this giant yellow, it was this little island right here called Taiwan. That's what we called China from 1949 to 1972. That place where everything is made in Taiwan. That was China. Like the United Nations, this giant, all countries get a seat at the table place. The China representative was from Taiwan, not China. We just ignored them. Yes, yeah, it was just a little island. So Nixon comes in and says, "This is ridiculous. Yes, they're communists. We're going to have to kind of deal with that." Shakes the hand, and since then, I mean, they've been one of our biggest trade partners. We'd be in real trouble if we hadn't been able to trade with China. In fact, we have borrowed more money from China than we have any other country. China controls more American debt than any other country in the world. I'm not sure that's a thumbs up, but that's where we are. So I guess that's a good thing. It does benefit us economically. We can thank Nixon for that. Something else one more thing I think that sticks out. Again, I think this is a thumbs up here, is that we have a lot of Americans that are still very terrified of nuclear weapons. You think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. People were hiding out in their bomb shelters. It's not like those nukes have gone away. They still exist. They're still out there. They're still targeting us. Right? They may not be in Cuba anymore, but they're still close enough. We're still terrified of these things. We're going to see Richard Nixon work with the Russians. Wow, not only is he working with our enemies in China, but he's also working with our enemies in Russia to try to limit the amount of nuclear weapons that we have on this earth. That's a huge thumbs up. All right, he's going to work with this fella with the giant eyebrows. All right, I don't know, but when I see this guy, Leonid Brezhnev, he's the head of Russia at this time, I cannot move past the eyebrows. They are two giant caterpillars. And but he was a very moderate guy. He was concerned about nuclear weapons like everybody else. Felt that these were a huge deal, something to be scared of. And so here you have Richard Nixon also feeling the same way. They're able to work together to sign two different treaties that are geared towards reducing the amount of nuclear weapons that we have. And I've got the names of those treaties up there. I think that they both could show up on this test later on this week. Maybe something like, which one of these is not a nuclear treaty? So if you see SALT, I wouldn't go for that answer. SALT is all about limiting nuclear weapons. ABM stands for anti-ballistic missile. All right, that's a form of a nuclear weapon. Now notice the word is reduce, not eliminate. We're not getting rid of nukes. We're simply limiting the amount of nukes that we produce. All right, so we're going to keep all of the ones that we have. We're just not going to make as many more new ones as we had been making. So guys, look, the first slide and this slide, Nixon seems to be doing all right. Look, we're in a time period where you've got folks in your life that were alive at this time. My parents in 1972 were in high school. They very clearly remember what it was like to live in Nixon America. And my mom will tell you, first time she got to vote in a presidential election was 1972. She voted for Richard Nixon. And she was proud to do so. He was really popular at that particular time, and maybe you can see why. There's a lot of good that he has done. But like I said, that one big downer is so big that it absolutely dooms his presidency. And what is that, obviously? Watergate. That's the only thing anybody remembers about Richard Nixon. Now, I don't feel bad for the guy. It's really bad. All right? But I think it's important that we recognize if that wouldn't have happened, we might be looking at Nixon as, one of these top 5 presidents. Get a new Mount Rushmore, Nixon's there. But Watergate was so bad that that's going to be his legacy. So let's talk about that, because it really is a big deal. First thing you need to know is that the Watergate is a place. Okay? It is a place. It is a hotel/office building in Washington, D.C. In fact, how many of you have seen the movie National Treasure? Right, we've seen this, all right? So think back to early on in that movie, Nicolas Cage is working out his plan to steal the Declaration. But he's not the only one trying to steal it, right? You got the bad guys. They're trying to steal it too. And when it goes over to them, as they're working out their plan, it zooms in on the hotel that they're staying in. It's the Watergate. All right, so if you go back and you watch that, you'll see it's a pretty distinctive building. Hotel rooms at the top, and you've got offices down at the bottom. This is where Forrest Gump was staying when he foiled the Watergate scandal. If you remember that part, he was there for the ping pong. You know what I'm talking about? He was the ping pong hero. And he meets President Nixon, and President Nixon asks him, hey, where are you staying? And he tells him the hotel, and he says, oh, no, I know, a much nicer hotel. Let me set you up. There he is, eating a hot fudge sundae in the Watergate. Calls at the front desk, and he says, I think the power must have gone out across the courtyard. People over there with flashlights. Forrest Gump. Foil Watergate. Somebody just remembered it. Yeah. All right, we're going to watch that movie in a couple weeks. You'll see what I mean here. All right, now, it may shock you that movie's not real. It really wasn't Forrest Gump. But everything else about it was real. All right? So let's find out what happened here. Now, we got to know something about Nixon. Nixon did a lot of good, but Nixon was paranoid to the nth degree. I don't know if you know anybody like that. Nixon was convinced 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, people are out to get him. He used to keep a heat and freeze list on his table in the Oval Office. I kid you not. Literally a piece of paper that said heat and freeze. And if your name got on the heat list, that meant that you were giving him a hard time. Maybe you were a newspaper reporter who was not saying nice things about President Nixon. The heat list meant, we want to scold this person. We don't want to treat them very well. But it's better than being on the freeze list. If you did something real bad and you ended up on the freeze list, that meant you were frozen out of the White House. No contact with Nixon, no contact with anybody that works there. He froze you out until you apologize. I mean, he's a bit of a child with this, all right? But that's what he did. Super paranoid. 72, Nixon, he's running for re-election, and he becomes convinced that the Democrats, Nixon was a Republican, that the Democrats have got something up their sleeve. Some secret weapon that they're going to use against him in this re-election. Now, there is a committee, a group of people that have come together to help President Nixon win re-election. It is called the Committee to Re-elect the President. That's a mouthful. You gotta call somebody up and ask for a donation. Say, hi, I'm so-and-so from the Committee to Re-elect the President. No, we need an acronym. So let's take the first words of that committee, first letters, and make an acronym. Unfortunately, it spells CREEP. And at no point did anybody say, this might be a turn off the donors. Hi, I'm so-and-so from CREEP. Please give me your money. This is what they call themselves, right? And so Nixon starts talking to some of the guys in CREEP, says, hey, Democrats, they're working on something. They're coming after me. They're working on something. We got to find out what this is. And so CREEP, can't make this stuff up, comes up with a plan. we're going to hire some guys, some professionals, some thieves here, and we're going to have them break in to the Democrat headquarters, which is located where? The Watergate office building. And we're going to have them ransack the room. And we're going to find that secret weapon. So that's what they did. They hired 5 professional thieves and had them go into the Watergate disguised as plumbers. And it wasn't Forrest Gump, but somebody. Somebody told on them, and the police caught them and arrested them. Now, if Nixon was paranoid before, that's going to get amped up a few notches here. Because does he know? Did he know that this was all going to happen? And if so, how big of a role did he play in this event? So, can you think of any group in the American government who their job it is to investigate things for the U.S. government? FBI, there we go, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So the FBI takes the case. We got to find out what's going on here. Was the president involved? Now, President Nixon, the smart thing to have done would have been to probably say, I did not know this was going to happen. If I had, I would not have ever allowed this to happen. I'm sorry. And you know what? These 5 guys probably would have gone to prison, and we could have moved on. Maybe, I don't know. But instead, what President Nixon does is he orders the CIA to stop the FBI. He sets one part of the government against the other. Now, we call that obstruction of justice, which, by the way, is a term that we're hearing a lot lately. When you obstruct something, you get in its way. That's what obstructing justice is here. And that's exactly what Nixon is doing here. He is getting in the way of justice being done. That's a felony, folks. That is not allowed. Then, just to add a little bit of salt to the wound here, information is leaked out that President Nixon was so paranoid that he secretly recorded every single conversation that took place in the Oval Office. And then he kept all of those convos on a series of tapes. And so, of course, the FBI says, we'd sure like to listen to those, see what Nixon said. And Nixon said, nah, I'm good. And finally, the FBI said no, and actually subpoenaed, right? Forced him to turn over the tapes. And when he did, one of the tapes had about a 20-minute section of it that just somehow malfunctioned and played as static. Yeah, so this is pretty bad here. But again, nobody has any evidence against President Nixon. Wow. That's until these 2 guys entered into the foray. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. These guys are newspaper reporters for the Washington Post. Here they are in all their 70s glory. Love that hair. Love that hair. All right. Bob Woodward's on the right, Carl Bernstein on the left. All right. And these newspaper reporters start publishing a series of very, very tell-all articles about everything that President Nixon knew and everything that he has done. And people are saying, how do you know these things? Well, they have a secret source. They have a leak in the Nixon administration who is feeding them actual, real information that is essentially proving that Nixon was dirty. Now, he didn't want his name to be put out there. Can you blame him? No, he wants to be whoever this is wants to keep it secret. So he tells Woodward and Bernstein, I will give you this information, but you cannot let people know my name. Instead, I want you to use a code name for me. Now, I'll tell you, a couple years from now, I may run into you and I'll say, hey, how much do you remember from that one day where we talked about Nixon and Watergate? You're probably honestly going to say, gosh, I don't remember much. But I bet that you'll remember the code name for this source The code name that they went with was Deep Throat. Yes, okay. So that's what the newspaper said. Deep Throat gives us information. Oh, you know, there's jokes here. Probably save those for outside of class. This is live streaming, by the way. I promise you, I didn't make this up, folks. Okay, that's the code name. So it was every day. Whoever this person was giving them information every day, and it's getting published in the Washington Post every day. And finally, Congress says, "Listen, you know, Deep Throat has given a lot of, it's like it pains me to say it, has given all this information. We have to do something. Like, you know, we can't let this go." And so they decide to impeach President Nixon. They really have to. All right. So the charges go forward in July of 1974. We're getting the process rolling here to impeach President Nixon. And honestly, Nixon's no idiot. He's got a choice to make here. He can either be the first president ever to be kicked out of office, or he can be the first president ever to resign from office. He picks the latter. He picks the resignation. Feels like that makes him look a little bit better. Now, what's funny here is that a couple of years ago we found out who Deep Throat really was. This was a big deal. Deep Throat was actually a guy named Mark Felt, who was at that point in time the deputy director of the CIA. So he knew his stuff. I mean, it was all legit. He knew that he was potentially putting his career in danger, but he decided to do it because he felt like this was wrong. And you know, he's a little bit of a hero, I think. You know, but he managed to keep this secret until just a few years ago when it came through. So I'll tell you what we're going to do. We only were able to get through this in the other period, and so what we're going to do is I'm going to finish things up. I'd like for you guys to watch the live on-air news conference that President Nixon gives to announce that he's going to resign. It's an important moment. I mean, this is one of those moments that, my folks, maybe your grandparents, they remember this coming in on national television. And the thing that I love most about this is that Nixon really lays it up. That I am going to resign because I know that that's what's best for the country. You know, I'm willing to put myself out there for you. Well, he really sells the sacrifice, the sacrificial lamb bit here. It's worth watching. So we'll watch this. Tomorrow when we come back, I'll need just a few minutes. Ford and Carter are pretty quick. But make sure that when we're done with this clip, you either keep it or you put it in the basket so that you won't lose it. But here's Richard Nixon, live news conference to announce his resignation.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation.